brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Alrighty, guys, we are going to start. We're on episode 36. We're doing the Battle of Plataea. We're still on Greco Persian Wars. We will never stop doing the Greco Persian Wars. Well, it's because it's, first of all, one of the best documented events, I think, in history of antique warfare, ancient warfare. And second of all, it's because, well, I mean, it is kind of, in a way, foundational for our modern society, whether or not we like that fact or not. So last time, we ended with the victory at Salamis, where the Athenian fleet, with the assistance of a bunch of other Greek city-states, managed to beat the Persian fleet. After which Xerxes was persuaded by his advisors, by his generals, to go ahead and take off and head back to Persia, where he had a state to run and things to do other than wage war on small, fairly poor, and not very friendly to the Persians, Greece. The Athenians, having won this victory, had promptly voted out of office their brilliant commander, Themistocles in English, and the Athenians and Spartans proceeded to get at each other's throats almost immediately after the victory. Mardonius, the Persian commander, as we remember, pulled back to Boeotia, where he had more or less neutral lands. From there, he started doing diplomacy. He started trying to negotiate with the Athenians to join up against the Spartans and offered to rebuild their capital and offered all kinds of bribes. And the Athenians proudly and loudly rejected this unseemly offer from the Persians. Okay, said the Persians, and Mardonius mustered up his troops, started marching against Athens again. And I'm just kind of repeating a little bit of what we did in the last episode towards the end. And Athenians again reached out to Spartans for help. Spartans didn't bother to come. So the Athenians once again had to get onto their lovely ships, abandon Athens, which they just barely started restoring and trying to rebuild, and evacuate again to the island of Salamis, where Mardonius proceeded to burn their capital, Athens, yet again, sack it yet again, in hopes that that will pressure the Athenians into signing basically peace treaty and bowing down to the Persians so he could go home and be done with this totally useless and hopeless and unnecessary war without losing face for the Persian Empire. Well, the Athenians at this point in time, cornered on an island, started debating on whether or not to maybe accept the Persian offer, which Mardonius once again offered them. And once again said to the Spartans, are you guys coming, or we're going to be doing this on our own? And at this point in time, the Spartans did actually promptly send out the military force, because they figured out that if the Athenians, their long-term enemies, pair up with the Persians, they're going to have a problem on their hands. And so once again, we have Mardonius with the elite land army, core troops that Xerxes left him, with no fleet to supply him whatsoever, marching up against the joint Greek forces. And this is where we left our lovely players last time. Now, as we remember, on the land, it's the very mighty Spartans who are our pretty much basic, fantastic fighting soldiers, and usually are in charge of the joint Greek force. Now, this time, the Greek force is the largest land Greek force that had ever gathered up till that point. And after that point, it's estimated around 80,000 fighters altogether. And because the Persian forces by this point in time have been severely diminished, and only the elite kind of the most capable military units were left on shore, the number of the troops was more or less comparable. How did the Greeks manage to gather up that many souls to put on that battlefield? Well, very simply. And we talked a little bit about it last time. Of course, the Spartans, as we all know, Sparta was not very much populated by the Spartans. It was mostly populated by the Helots, which were the Achaean Greeks from the whole Iliad, written by Homer, the original Achaean Greek population that lived in that region had been subjugated by the Spartans, and this entire time has been living in a state not of just slavery, but of uttermost terror, being treated less than humans and more or less routinely terrorized by the Spartans, which is why the Spartans were in such an amazing military shape, well, because they were constantly at war with their rural population. And so this time, the Spartans, who brought to the battlefield a contingency of about 5,000 elite Spartan warriors, they also brought with them estimated between 35 to 39,000 helots. We talked a little bit about this last time. I still find it very strange that the helots did not turn around and hit them in the back during the Battle of Plataea. But nonetheless, that severely bumped up the numbers in the Greek ranks. The Athenians brought with them about 8,000 warriors. And then there were other various Greek allied forces there who also brought their military. Yeah, David is correcting me that the Spartans also had allies with them. There were just various allied forces. So altogether, we have about 80,000. The Persian number is estimated somewhere in the vicinity of 120,000, plus or minus. We don't know exactly. Now, Persians had their cavalry, and they had their light infantry, and they had their heavy infantry. The Greeks most likely had their heavy infantry, which severely outweighed the Persian heavy infantry, and their light infantry, mostly in the form of helots and various non-elite, non-citizen members of various city-states that did not have the funds to be able to afford the armor that they required to fight in the front lines. Let me go ahead and pull up some images of the actual armament, but we talked about it a little bit last time. So our Greeks were fairly heavily armored. They had helmets that protected them very well from any arrows that would be falling from the sky. They had their chests protected. They had their extremities protected. They fought, as we know, in a phalanx, which was very effective. And their shields they were solid. They were about 1 meter wide around, and they were fairly maneuverable shields that were easy to wield. They were bronze covered. They were fairly heavy duty. I mean, Greeks at that point in time were not particularly large men. All the heavy armor on them that really did add to the punching force of any individual warrior. So now we have our Persians here. This is light infantry. That's the archers. The Persians had woven wicker shields that were very tall, that were mostly designed to protect the archers who were stationary during the initial attack from any enemy arrows that were coming their way. These were mainly used as basically barriers to protect the archers. That's the light infantry. So right here we have light versus heavy infantry. These would be the elite forces. They also had similar shields. Those shields, again, were designed to be able to block off any assault, to catch any arrows. And because these elite heavy infantry troops were intended to be able to gather up and protect the light infantry peoples with a wall of shields. And then of course, they had their chariots, but those were not heavily used in this particular warfare, just simply because, Greece is not very conducive to chariots. Here's another image. So the light infantry that Persians were employing was mostly really archers. Their heavy infantry was a little bit better protected, but not as well armored by any means as the Greeks were, because as last time David had mentioned, what the armor that they had, even though it had some metal blade covering it, that was basically stitched onto a leather base, and you could get under those individual pieces of metal and actually get to the body of the soldier. So when Mardonius realized that the Greeks were not going to be his friend and that the Greeks were going to go ahead and unite against him and fight him, he pulled back from Athens. He pulled back to the city of Plataea. And this is where the famous Battle of Plataea took place. Let's see who was commanding from each side, and let's see what tactics each side was employing. Does anybody have any comments while I'm pulling this up real quick?
I did have one comment. It's almost kind of a question for people that know more, but the armor that the Persians had with the sort of scales, they were probably just anticipating in the design arrows that came from above, not spears that came from below, and that was probably the shortfall, I guess. Something like that.
Well, yes, more or less, because the Persians were most often, they were used to fighting in a more of an open field. They were used to fighting enemies who either were fighting very similarly to them or who were completely inferior to them. So
there are trade-offs in infantry type fighting. Like the light infantry is light, like move around. They're a lot more mobile, but of course they're not as defended. The heavy infantry is they move in phalanxes. They're a lot more defensible, but they're not as movable.
Right. So here is the terrain we're going to be looking at right here. Just before we even start with our disposition of troops, I just want to show you what the terrain is looking like. I kind of made up this map. So here is basically the city of Plataea, more or less the Greek camp. Here's the Persian camp. The Persian camp, Mardonius, located in a place, you see these ridges right here? That's more or less mountainous high hills begin. This is a spring which is essential for water supplies for the Greeks. Persians camp over here. They need a lot of water. They have horses. They have cavalry. They camp behind the river. And what Mardonius does, having learned from his experience, from the Persian experience at the Marathon battle, where the lightly armored Persian archers were overran by the advancing Greek troops, he decided to, first of all, build a very fortified camp. Now, of course, this is a temporary camp. Another thing that he does, when he lines up his people in the field, he lines them up, his archers, with stationary shield defense walls to prevent that same thing happening that happened during the Battle of Marathon, to prevent the Greeks from attacking more or less defenseless light infantry archers. So here's the disposition. Right here is the disposition before the fighting began. So the Persians line up behind the river. And the way the Persians usually aligned up their troops, and here's the strategy. They usually would line up in the middle, their light infantry intermingled with their heavy infantry. The heavy infantry served the purpose of protecting the lightly armored light infantrymen. And then on the flanks, the Persians would usually line up their cavalry. So here is, you have your heavy infantry right here, you have your light infantry, you have your cavalry. This is the original position. Now, the Greeks were all lined up directly on the other side of the river. And the Greeks took up an interesting position. They took up a position right up against the rising slopes of the hill, so that the cavalry would not have much of success running them over, simply because if they went at them at full gallop, they would start running uphill, and that's not the most advantageous point. And understanding this fact, for quite a while, Mardonius paused and did not attack. He did so because he was hoping to lure the Greek forces from this position to the plains where his cavalry could easily attack and run them over. So the Persian strategy up until this point in time has been to shower their enemy with lots of arrows and break up their ranks, at which point in time the cavalry would surround the enemy from the two sides, enemy that was already broken up and began running, and the cavalry would more or less be used to just chase down the escaping enemy and basically finish them off. It was a strategy that has been very, very effective in their fighting of a lot of other peoples that they encountered. The idea was that the infantry in the center would remain stationary. Infantry was not intended necessarily to engage the enemy at all. They were just intended to disrupt the enemy ranks, and then the cavalry would move in and finish off the job. The Greeks, of course, had a different strategy altogether. The Greeks had the strategy of standing shoulder to shoulder and protecting each other in a very tight formation, as we talked about it last time in the phalanx. So whom did the Persians have with them? Well, the Persians had with them within their army, they had the elite Persians, they had the Median troops that they were basically part of the Persian Empire, and they also had the various allied Greek city-states. The Greeks also had three components to them. There were the Athenians. So the Athenians were on the left flank. On the right flank were the Spartans. And in the center, they had all the other various adjacent Greeks that came to join them. And so what they did is they pretty much created a sandwich with the Athenians on this side. Then you had two various more or less dependable, not dependable Greeks here, and then you had the Spartans. And so they stood like that for quite a long period of time, until at last they decided to act. And what happened is Mardonius, who got tired of the standoff, tried to lure the Greeks out of their positions. And he sent in his cavalry detachment with very minimum number of troops, but with an elite commander. and the commander got killed. The idea was to disrupt the Greeks' supply lines. The idea was to break up the Greek comfort in their position. And it was just intended to be a quick and easy raid. But what happened is when the cavalry broke into the Greek ranks, whether it was luck, chance, but the elite Persian commander got slain and his body fell to the Greeks. And the Greeks were very, very, very empowered by this immediate and kind of sudden victory. And so in that sense, though, the raid that Mardonius undertook was not very successful. He lost an elite commander. It was successful in the sense that the Greeks started to move. They started to do something. By the way, Masistus was the name of the leader of the Persian cavalry, their cavalry commander. And he was dressed very lavishly. He was, dressed in gold. He was very visible, as at that time all the commanders tended to be. When the Greeks got hold of his body, they marveled at this golden clad, richly dressed man, and the morale among the Greeks flew up to the sky. The leader of the Greeks in this particular battle was none other than the nephew of our glorious King Leonidas. King Leonidas' son himself was too young, of course, to participate in battle at this time, so it was his nephew who stepped in and was the commander of the Spartan army. And his name was Pausanias. Pausanias was unusual for a Spartan commander in the sense that he was very, some call him timid. I would say that he was reserved. He did not take any rash action. He kind of stood his ground and he did not allow his troops to lose their heads. What were the Helots doing during this entire standoff when you had the lined up positions of the Persians against Greeks? Well, the Helots, we talked about it a little bit last time, and I would have thought that they would have sent the Helots forward, but no, the Helots were actually behind the Spartan lines, I guess, creating the bulk. I'm sure that at the moment when the battle actually came on, the Helots probably were able to add to the chaos and create that extra padding for the Persian cavalry to get stuck in. But as far as actually participating in the battle itself, they were not in the front ranks as we would expect. They were in the back ranks. So originally we had our Persians right here. We had our Greeks right here. When the Greeks command retreat, the Spartans pull back this way. They're trying to retreat in this direction. Over here, the Athenians wind up on the left flank, facing with the left flank with the right flank of the Persian army, which is the various allied Ionian and other Greeks, including Thebans. And then other varied Greeks pull back towards the city of Plataea. Persians, having misunderstood what just happened, decide that the Greeks are running away and they commit to full pursuit. The cavalry right here goes up against the Spartans. On this side, the Greeks are fighting against the Greeks for various Persian cavalry assaults. And in the center, we have varied allied Greeks up against varied light and heavy infantry Persians. So Mardonius sends his best troops against the Spartans. Pausanias refuses to give up the higher ground. So again, I'm just going over the details. The Persians cut off the Greek access to the spring. And at which point in time, desperate Greeks in the dark try to retreat. They retreat to these positions. And a single Spartan unit is left behind to cover up the Greek retreat. Spartans are thinking that everybody is retreating in an orderly manner and in the correct direction. That is not the case. Athenians go one way, various assorted Greeks go the other way. The Spartans are more or less left on their own. And in the morning, they face the might of the Persian cavalry. Now, the cavalry that the Persians had at this point in time was not the cavalry as we think about it later on. Nothing like the knights, medieval knights, even early medieval period. They're nothing like later pre-World War I, 19th, 18th century cavalry. This is cavalry without stirrups. This is cavalry that probably is fairly lightly armored and that is riding horses that are about half the size of the horses we're used to today. This is the cavalry that is mostly designed to chase down running enemy and hit them in the back. Nonetheless, it is a cavalry assault against infantry, which is usually not very well held off by the infantry units. The Spartans held off the cavalry assault, and the Spartans were able to turn the cavalry back. At this point in time, the Athenians, who are on the other side fighting other Greeks, are still fighting the other Greeks. But in the center, the various Greeks, seeing that the Persian cavalry is retreating, wind up hitting full force against the center of the Persian forces, which is their light and heavy infantry. Am I making sense so far? Are you guys able to follow? Because this is a fairly convoluted breakdown.
Wherever the positions were ended up being after the Greek retreat, the course of the battle's basically the same. The Tegeans, who were the Spartans' allies, would end up charging. They were being showered with arrows just like at a marathon, and so they took the same tactics, and everybody kind of followed suit. I think that's basically the course of the infantry fight. And once those heavy hoplites closed with even the lighter, quote unquote, heavy infantry of the Persians, it was pretty much over, because the Greeks were heavily armored in comparison.
So the Persians are lined up on one side of the river with their allied Greek forces right here, and with the various other forces, Persian assorted forces in the center. The Greeks are lined up right here. Okay. Initial cavalry raid cuts off the Greeks from their supply lines and from the water lines. In that cavalry raid, a Persian high-ranking commander gets killed, which initially really ups the spirits of the Greeks, but in the process, they also lose that access to their supply lines and to water, at which point in time, they are forced to take some action because they cannot function without that access. So Spartans tell everybody, let's pull back, and they start pulling back under the cover of the night. Yeah, under the cover of the night is something that is not done much in fighting in that time period. So a bunch of confusion happens. The Athenians wind up pulling in one direction. The various allied Greek troops wind up pulling towards Plataea. And the Spartans over here think that they're covering the retreat of the army, when in fact they're covering only their own retreat. In the morning, the Persians wake up and they notice the Greeks have left. And Mardonius says, oh, no, you're not going to run from us. So he commits his entire army. His army crosses from behind the river to the front of the river, his entire army. The various allied Persian Greeks engage with the Athenians. The elite cavalry is sent against the Spartans. The troops in the middle, which is the light infantry and some heavy infantry, creates a wall, a barricade of shields, and is stationary and is more or less showering the enemies with arrows. The Spartans break the tide. They manage to defeat the Persian elite cavalry, and they start pushing back. Where they join and gain, this is just one interpretation, was that center Greek forces, while the Athenians over here are still fighting with the Greek allies of the Persians. When the cavalry starts retreating, that creates a panic, and in the ranks of the Persians. Mardonius, seeing the fact that his cavalry is getting defeated, loses control. That's my interpretation. Again, whether or not he lost control, whether or not it was a tactical decision, it was not a good decision. He himself is very visible. He's very richly dressed. He has with him his elite guard of about 1,000 of elite Persian troops, and he throws himself up against the Spartans. Herodotus gives us the account that what happens is one of the Greeks who lost his spear, who lost his shield, who lost his sword, picks up a boulder and throws it at Mardonius, hits him on the head, Mardonius dies. Whether or not it happened this way, whether or not the death of Mardonius was something stupid like that, we have no way of finding out. Bottom line is, it seems that the Persians lose their top commander, basically their general. When other allied various Greeks see it now, Athenians is still over here fighting with other Greeks. While the other allied Persians see the fact that their commander fell because he's such a visible figure, he's the shining knight in the middle of the battlefield, for lack of a better term, they start panicking. The elite 1,000 personal guard that was with Mardonius marches up against the Spartans, and they fight and they die to the last man. The archers, the Persian archers, are stuck behind their shield walls. Mardonius, when he had them construct these shield walls that are stationary, thought that he was protecting them from the same disaster that happened during the Marathon battle. That is, the undefended archers getting ran over by the heavy Greek hoplites. What he does instead, now he's dead by this point in time, but his actions are still reverberating across the field, is that his archers are now not mobile. They're stuck in their original position. But with their backs to river, under very questionable protection of tall wicker shields that the Greek hoplites can cut through like pretty much paper, which is exactly what the Greek hoplites proceed to do. Now, the 1,000 elite are dead. Mardonius is dead. Their cavalry commander died early on. There is one commander still left on the field, and that is the Saki leader, the Scythian leader of the Scythian cavalry, who brought his own tribe. They're basically recently conquered Persian allies, Callimachos. And he takes his Scythians and says bye-bye, and he gets the heck out of Dodge. And that's the last of the capable, without even engaging the enemy. That's the last of the capable Persian elite fighting forces. Now, the archers are being slaughtered. They start to run. They start to run back towards the camp across the river. At this point in time, the Athenians finish their own separate fight, and they also join with the other Greeks. And the Greeks start chasing the panicking, broken up Persian light infantry, because they already lost their cavalry and they already lost their heavy infantry, who is in a panic, escaping across the river back to the defended fortified camp. Majority of the Persians get slaughtered by the Greeks as they're running. Whatever is left, about 10,000 people is estimated, will lock themselves inside the camp, barricade themselves in. The Greeks surround it, and they slaughter pretty much everyone there, or take as prisoners, as slaves. The Persian army on the continent is completely destroyed. The only unit that manages to survive this particular absolutely horrific disaster for the Persian army is the Scythian unit, the Saki unit.
And the stragglers.
Well, yeah, then of course there's some individuals who may have survived. Bottom line is the Saki unit that more or less fled the battlefield without engaging the enemy. Mardonius is dead. All the elite Persian fighters are dead. Persian army ceases existing on the continent. It is a resounding Greek victory. Herodotus reports ridiculous amounts of Persian losses. I mean, 100,000 or something like that. And he reports very low, couple thousand of losses on the Greek side. How many? 1,300 hoplites. Now, what is underreported in this particular account is the helots, who likely got slaughtered en masse because they would have not been armored very well whatsoever during this whole very messy, very confusing, and very complicated battle. I'm going to stop and see if anybody has anything to say.
If there's a rout, the losses can be really, really heavy on the one side. Like when people start to run, they can't defend themselves as easily. So that the other guys, they can just wipe them out. So that heavy losses on one side is actually possible.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So just a couple of things, and the evacuation by the Greeks de facto created a situation of what you might call a soft center that the Persians thought they could exploit. But their forces were very mismatched. The Greeks, and again, by default, this wasn't, I don't think it was by intent, but by default found themselves where they have heavy flanks on both sides of the Persians, a weak center that the Persians came into, and they could close them off from either side, mismatched against forces. So you had this total force mismatch that allows the Greek to close in on the Persians, close them off, and finish them off. And moving forward some hundreds of years, this is one of the battles that Hannibal studied the most.
Right.
And he yearned to recreate this scenario, which he was able to at the Battle of Cannae.
Yeah.
So again, we're projecting forward, but that's Hannibal. In some future episodes here, Hannibal will soon demonstrate the value of studying history.
Exactly. I would also point out the role of the helots and the other light infantry on the Greeks here. This is on rocky hill slope, and these shepherds and people could probably sling rocks. That Mardonius was killed by someone with a rock seems kind of unlikely, but under those circumstances, And as Julie was saying a minute ago, other sources besides Herodotus set the casualties on the Greek side at about 10,000. And most of those would have probably been your light troops that were skirmishers and javelin men and slingers and stuff like that. So it was a real battle, but like Chris was saying a few minutes ago, once you turn your backs, that's when the real slaughter begins in any of these ancient battles.
Absolutely. And a quick question is, these battles are occurring at a time of these are muscle-powered battles. People have only so much endurance. So over a matter of, like, honestly, I mean, how long are we talking about as far as these battles occurring? Honestly, they're matters of hours in a day.
Well, and yeah, you're absolutely right. And here's another thing. I mean, the armor that these people were wearing, I mean, was heavy. Okay, these are hot territories, really hot territories. Now, the Persians were much more lightly armored. They didn't even have helmets per se. At best, they had those kind of woven, not woven, but felt caps that were good for catching arrows, but were not very good for protecting you from spears and from heavy swords and so forth.
And you think when they're using things like slings, if they had lead shot, a sling is about the same power as a .45 pistol today. Studies have been done to show that they're actually deadly as slingers, but they're very lightly armored and they're very fast moving, so they can make quite a punch in a battle.
Right. And on top of all, these are people who, I mean, today there are people who practice this whole using the slings, the whole slings thing. But even today's competition winners are nowhere near these shepherds who did this daily to chase away predators from their sheep, to fight local, village to village skirmishes. I mean, they played with these sort of very simple looking, but actually very effective weapons from very small age when they were just little boys, and they were perfect at it. I mean, they could time their assaults with the various objects that they would launch in such a manner that not only would they fly in the right direction, but they and hit the target, but they could do it simultaneously. I mean, this is something that was still used, I think, as far as late 18th, early 19th century occasionally, and it's been shown to be very, very effective. But again, the high ground cavalry running up a hill is not a good idea. Big fat question on how the Spartans were able to stop the cavalry assault. I suspect that the cavalry assault was not, we don't have the idea of knights, with this sheer wall of death of metal and heavy horse bodies that were enormous rolling at you. These are small step horses.
The cavalry was basically just like taller infantry. They had the advantage of height, but not of the bulk of later heavy cavalry.
Right, and they were not designed to do the punch, how the knights did it when you have your spear pointing forward and you run the enemy. They would mostly be either doing it overhead or they were using their swords. Whatever method they were fighting by, they did not have stirrups. They did not have proper saddles to really put their weight up against. Some of this cavalry was light cavalry. It wasn't heavy cavalry that was mostly used to operating in the steppes, using, basically more or less bow and arrow, especially the Scythian troops. And the Spartans, who were very heavily armored and were very crazy and were just physically, each one of them at that point in time represented an equivalent of a tank, really. I mean, they could just gut those horses. I think that's the only way you can explain it. The fact that they stood against the cavalry assault, which I don't care what size your horse is. I mean, when you have a whole herd of them coming at you at full speed, that's scary. Mm-hmm. But that's when going up the hill becomes the advantageous point. Nathan, you were going to say something?
Yes. The Spartans also had very long, pointy spears.
Right.
And against lightly, those horses had no armor. They had no protection. And you plant the butt of the spear in the ground, and that horse doesn't stand much of a chance.
The thing is, how do you force that horse to run up against this bulky object in front? I don't think you do. I think what's going to happen is the horse is going to start breaking, going, no, I don't think so. And then
And
the horse is kind of going to ram into the...
They weren't using stirrups either, because like the knights in the stirrup, they would give them the force behind the lances. But of course, these people didn't have that, so they were could be easily knocked off their horses.
Exactly, or just gutted from horses could be gutted easily.
Yeah, just to comment on that a little bit. One, you can't make horses dive onto pointed objects. Horses have a survival instinct themselves, and but the Spartans were probably, in going to Julie's question on how the Spartans stopped them, disciplined infantry armed with spears, or particularly pikes, can win that psychological battle with horses. If they charge the horses panic. That's how the Swiss pikemen in the 1500s could break the heavy European knights. Again and again they did it. And so I suspect the Spartans, being as disciplined as they were, charged the horses.
Just a couple of things. First, I never would have suspected it, but I was given a handmade sling by somebody, and it is a surprisingly effective weapon. It just takes a lot of skill to master, but you can really throw rocks very hard and hit an object even the size of a head at distance. The other thing that I wonder about is if it was actually easy in some cases for the Greeks to trick the Persians, specifically the cavalry, onto rocky footing that their horses just simply had trouble navigating, and that would have just been chaos for the cavalry in general. And then, since the subject of the spears and how, yes, horses are smart, they're like deer, they don't run into pointy things sticking out at them, they don't run into things going across that they can get, you know, hit in the neck or the head with. But it was probably pretty easy for a good spearman to simply, you know, charge ahead, take a position, and then raise a spear out of nowhere, which probably would have helped also. But just a couple of thoughts.
Right. And here's the thing, that by this point in time, cavalry was already demoralized. I mean, the elite Persian cavalry was already demoralized. They lost their commander right at the beginning. By the time that all of this entire melee was happening, I mean, Persians were disjointed. And I think that the real responsibility for this particular defeat lies on Mardonius, who was a very experienced commander, who has been with this campaign from the very start, who was so frustrated by this point in time, so bloody, exhausted with dealing with the Greeks. I mean, Xerxes opened up this Pandora's box. He started this war. Mardonius was the one who was dealing with the mess that was created by Xerxes. His advice was repeatedly ignored. Then when Xerxes took majority of his troops and the supply in the form of the fleet and went away, Mardonius was the one who was left behind. He tried negotiating once. He tried negotiating twice. He tried negotiating a third time. He won multiple separate victories. I mean, he took Athens twice, sacked it twice. He was ready to go home. He was done. He was just done. And I think what happened at this final battle is that Mardonius was at the point where he basically decided it's either, you know, take it all or lose it all. And I don't think that he believed that he was capable of losing in this situation. I don't think he quite estimated just how many numerically Greeks there were going to be. I think that he relied too heavily on their tactic of showering the enemy with arrows and breaking the enemy up. Well, it didn't break the enemy up. He misunderstood the Greek tactical, terribly disorganized retreat and charged forward. At this point in time, just tired of the standoff. Again, his heavy infantry, his immortals were no match for the Spartans and for general Greek hoplites, just because their armor was much lighter, and it was much more flexible and much more vulnerable to enemy assault. And the commander charging ahead of the army, of course, being visible as the commanders were back then, and getting killed was absolute. The moment that Mardonius was killed, more or less, the war was over for all intents and purposes. There were some other battles happening. We will talk a little bit about the aftermath next time, because there's a lot of Greek fighting over who won the battle, and a lot of Greek city-states who didn't make it to the battlefield later building their memorials as if they were in the battle at the city state at the location of Plataea, pretending that they were actually part of the battle when they were not. And then there was the Spartans and the Athenians, once again at each other's throats, almost immediately after this joint victory. And of course, them all uniting together to punish the Thebans, who did not, who were more on a Persian side. And there was, of course, that almost simultaneously happening on the other side of the sea, and that is the Battle of Mycale. And where, once again, the Persians were overrun by the Greeks. Again, well, that's a whole separate battle. And bottom line is, I think at this point in time, the morale of the Persian army and their will to fight for this stupid, rocky, very stubborn, and very unpleasant terrain was pretty much done for. And Xerxes had to go home and face the music because he just lost a lot of Persian lives in this very unnecessary, little, glorious, easy war, more or less. And yeah, well, he almost lost his throne over this whole mess. So does anybody else have anything else to say?
I would add that the so anachronism for the Persian commander is halt, and that is when to stop. So hungry, he was too hungry. He was angry. He was lonely. He wanted to be back home, and he was tired.
Yep.
And so all of those are signs that you need to take a time out, and his troops deserve better. And it's not any degradation to the quality and the honor, the fighting spirit of the soldiers that he had. They're poorly led.
Yeah, and on top of Mardonius, there was sitting yet another commander, and that's the king himself, Xerxes, who was breathing down his neck, going, come on, do this, victory, victory, victory. I mean, he was looking at chances of being in a seriously dangerous personal situation if he did not win this glorious. So I think that pressure from the overseeing authority probably also played its part. Again, this is a battle that we have only Herodotus and a couple other accounts of. Most of those accounts already are reconstructions. All the people who have tried to reconstruct the battle have come up with their own reconstructions. We only have so much information about how it went down, but what we know is that the Spartans definitely led the united forces, that the Spartans contributed to the command, that the Greeks held their ground, and that Spartans turned the tide of the battle and allowed the Greeks to win and to continue pushing with their victory until they basically cleared their land of the Persian presence. Okay, so the next one, we're going to wrap up the Greeks and then go and do something else like Australia or something. I don't know. Just something else entirely. I don't know. Vietnam, Australia, I don't care.
Still got the Polynesians.
Oh, Polynesians, whatever. Anything else. Anything else at this point in time. Because the Greeks, we're going to have a lot more Greeks.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, thanks, guys. I hope this wasn't too confusing, but it is kind of a essential and convoluted story. So, all right. Well, thank you, guys.
No, it's a very good. It's actually an incredibly pivotal battle that's not discussed much, and it's really, I would say, it's kind of a watershed moment, East and West. Battle that's actually very important.
Yeah, and I think we also hear a lot about Marathon. We hear an awful lot about the 300 Spartans, but those were kind of precursors. They really were. I mean, I think that the real action really took place right here on the Battle of Plataea. So, all right, guys. Well, thank you, everyone. It's really good to see everyone, and I will see everyone 2 weeks from now.
Thanks as always. Everybody be well.
Okay, bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Both cast our shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every every man's soul.